Hi again, everybody. One more week till your AP exam. This week, we're going to work through the rest of Unit 3, 4, 5, and 6. And today's video finishes review topic number 3 that we had started last week. In last week's video, we focused on just in general energy, and then we looked at enzymes. In this video, we're going to focus on two specific processes that involve energy. We're going to look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So photosynthesis, if you remember, is going to use the materials of carbon dioxide and water, and with the help of sunlight energy, it's going to take those atoms and those molecules and build sugar. So because this reaction is using energy, and we're going from molecules that are more simple to more complex, this is going to be an endergonic reaction. Energy is going to be required, and we're going to be building up molecules. So we could also call this anabolic, right? That's a building type reaction. If you remember, there are two phases to photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions, oftentimes just called the light reactions, and then also the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle or the light-independent reactions. To take a minute, I would click on this animation down here in the right-hand corner. It walks you through the molecular process of that. So pause the video there, watch that quick little animation, and then we will pick up with the sample question on the next slide. So as you know, in the light reactions of photosynthesis, light is required. Light is absorbed by pigments. And you know that pigments absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect others. Something that we can look at that tells us what is absorbed and what is reflected is called an absorption spectrum. Okay, so read this and then use the figure, which we call the absorption spectra, on the other slide. And then we will talk about how to answer this question if you would see this on the AP exam. So in this absorption spectra, we are looking at two different pigments, and we don't know which is which. Part A is asking you to identify which absorption spectrum is chlorophyll and which one is bacteriodopsin. Taking a look at this, we can see that for this particular pigment, which we don't know what it is, we have a fairly low absorption here at this wavelength, but then we see a spike of absorption somewhere around 550-ish, okay? This particular pigment, we see a spike of absorption around 440-ish, and then we see fairly low absorption, so we can assume that that light is being reflected. And then we have another peak around maybe 675. This also gives you the color wavelengths of visible light. So we go through our Roy G. Biv, right? So our rainbow of colors, and this is telling us the wavelengths of those lights. So based on that, we can see that pigment number 1, because it's absorbing light somewhere around 550-ish, we're probably somewhere in the yellow range or the yellow-green range. So that light is being absorbed and all other colors are being reflected. For graph number 2, we see that somewhere the violet or bluish light is being absorbed, and we also see the other end of the spectrum, so probably the orangish and maybe some yellow being absorbed there. Based on this data, this question wants you to decide which one is chlorophyll and which one is bacteriodopsin. Now remember, a pigment appears the color that it is because that is the color light that's being reflected. So for example, if you have a red pigment in your shirt, it is absorbing all of the other colors and reflecting light back to your eyes that are the red range. So using that, which graph would be which? Okay, so here is our answer key for this. Graph 1 is bacteriodopsin and graph 2 is chlorophyll. And here's our big hints. Because this showed that a lot of the yellowish greenish light was being absorbed and not reflected, we know that that's bacteriodopsin. Over here, we see that the yellowish and greenish is not being absorbed, it's being reflected, and it's coming back to your eyes, and you would see that as being green. Which pigment appears green? Chlorophyll does. So based on these graphs, that's how we would figure out which pigment is which, based on what is absorbed and what is reflected. So for part A, again, bolded or underlined words, identify the pigments, so which graph was which, explain and justify your answer. So let's take a look at some better graphs here, or some better responses here. You could have said that the organism containing bacteriodopsin appears purple because that pigment absorbs light in the green range, like we saw, and it reflects the violet or red and blue, right? Red and blue, when they're mixed together, look purple. So that is why that first graph would be bacteriodopsin. So this would be your explanation and your justification. You could also use some data from that chart and say that, well, the light in the range from 350 to 450 is somewhere around the violet range. And you could also say that the red and blue ranges are also being reflected, and use those values. So I would suggest also using some numbers when you're justifying anything on the AP exam. You would also then go into explaining the chlorophyll. Because they want you to explain and justify both, make sure when you're responding that you're writing about both. So this would be your explanation and your justification for the bacteriodopsin. Here is your explanation and your justification for the chlorophyll, right? So graph 2 showed chlorophyll because green is being reflected, and all of the other pigments in the red ranges and the blue ranges are being absorbed. And again, to make sure you're earning the point for the justify, I would maybe even use some numbers and say the wavelengths between 390 and 450 are being absorbed, and they are in the violet and blue range. The light between 450 and 650 roughly are the yellow and the green range, so they are being reflected. And then going on to saying that between 650 and 700 are the red and orange ranges, and you could say that that's what's being absorbed as well. Okay, so make sure when you're writing your response that you are justifying and explaining thoroughly. Okay, so let's go back and look at part B. Now they're talking about an experiment, and they tell you all these different things that we're doing in that experiment, and they want you to predict the relative rate of photosynthesis. Now, when they say relative, they really just want you to say the highest, the lowest, in the middle. They're not asking you to give a number. Okay, so don't freak out. You don't have to calculate anything. You're just kind of saying highest, lowest, and in the middle. And then again, there's that word justify. Give your reasonings as to why that would be the case. So if you flip ahead to where we left off, here is the rubric that came from the College Board. This would be a good spot to pause and make sure that you understand what they were looking for. So in this next section, we're going to take a look at cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, if you remember, is taking food molecules, whether this is inside the plant itself or once a plant is consumed, taking those food molecules and breaking them down to release the energy inside of them. Because this takes a more complex molecule like glucose and breaks it into something more simple like carbon dioxide and water, and because energy is released from this process, we could call this process catabolic, and we could also call it exergonic. Now, anaerobic processes do not use oxygen, and they only involve the first step, which is glycolysis, and then the route takes them to fermentation. If that is in us, that's going to be lactic acid fermentation. If that's in organisms like yeast, that's going to be alcoholic fermentation. But what we spent the majority of our time on was the aerobic. So going through all of the phases of cellular respiration. So we have glycolysis, then we have the pyruvate conversion step, then we have the Krebs cycle, and then we have our electron transport chain. The video linked at the bottom shows you that again. So I would pause the video here, watch that quick little clip, and then we will take a look at our AP question. So here is our AP question from 2012, and we're looking at seedlings germinating. Now notice that in this question, they do not use the word cellular respiration, but something that is key is that they're talking about oxygen consumption. And if you remember, aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen. So they are talking about cellular respiration here. Before you look at the prompt on these problems, I would take a second and just look at the graph and figure out what are you looking at. So pause the video here, take a look at the graph, try to come up with a general description of what this is showing you, and then read the 3 parts of the prompt, and then we will work through those 3 parts. When you're thinking about this experiment, we did something similar with germinating peas, and then some of you tested things like crickets and worms, and this really is showing you the same thing. How much oxygen did each of those organisms consume? Now, part A is asking for rate again. We calculated rate in a previous video. And remember, that's going to be change in X over change in Y, so final minus initial. So something to really focus on is they want you to do this for each. So if we go back to our graph, they want you to do every single line. So just to walk you through one, we would take the final oxygen consumption for variety A minus the initial, so 5 point whatever, minus 0, over the change in time, 80 minutes minus 0 minutes. So we're really taking 5 point something over 80, okay? On this next slide over here, they do walk you through that. Okay, so there's your answers for each of the varieties for part A. Notice how they were doing all 4 calculations. For part B, we wanted to see, okay, now what is the relationship here? What is the relationship between the rate of the reaction or the metabolism and the oxygen consumption? So based on our graph, we saw that at a higher metabolism, we're going to see more oxygen being consumed. Or if you flipped it and wrote this way, lower metabolism, lower oxygen consumption. Either one of those would have earned you the point. The next part of this is discuss the effect of temperature for each. So again, they want you to talk about each variety. So talking about variety A, talking about variety B, higher temperature, higher reaction rate, right? Higher metabolism or higher oxygen consumption. Here are some other ways that you could also earn points for part B. You could earn up to 3 points there depending on how much you wrote. Part C is now, again, here we go, looking at, well, what if we do something different? What if we have a new experiment? And they're tying this in to something you know about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration requires these electron carriers, one of them being NAD+. And NAD+ takes the electrons from the breaking down reaction, so from glycolysis, from the Krebs cycle, and takes them to the electron transport chain. If you remember, the electron transport chain is where all the magic happens. So if we are not able to have NADH, we're basically going to see no cellular respiration or no metabolism. So the first point would be the prediction. What would happen? And then the second part is the explanation, why? And that's basically what we just said. Okay, so why would that not happen? Okay, at the end of this, you'll see that there's a nice list of things that you should be able to do. Take a look at this list, make sure you can kind of check these off, and then try your practice problems on AP Classroom. Thanks, guys.